Okay, greetings and a warm welcome to all those who've logged in and shall be logging in to the Rail 200, the second day of the fifth global conference of the Rail Enthusiast Society, or RES. We had a wonderful day yesterday with lots of speakers from different parts of the world. I'm sure today also we'll also have a great number of people enjoying the varied lectures that they're going to take place today. The first session is on America's first transcontinental railroad and its effects. The speaker is William Blaylock, and the moderation will be done by Manik Nandan Venkataramanan. Mani is a finance and a risk management professional who has obtained his Chartered Financial Analyst CFA and Financial Risk Manager Charter. He did his MS in Finance from the University of Pittsburgh. He currently serves as a senior consultant with one of the big four American consulting firms. An avid rail fan and an active and passionate member of the Rail Enthusiast Society, he is interested in reading about the past and the present of railroading, its operations and technology. He serves as the director of the UK based World Alliance of Tourist Trams and Trains, where he represents India. He is also a member of the UK based Advanced Steam Traction Trust. He connects and liaises with various railroad associations in the US. Above all, he is an active member of the Rail Enthusiast Society. Before I hand over to Mani, I'd just like to make 2 points for the audience that is for the audience. Number one, kindly keep their microphones muted throughout the lecture. Second, questions, if any, should be typed in the chat box. There should be no direct speaking. Over to you, Mani.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pandey, for such a wonderful introduction. Uh, Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure and it's indeed a honor to introduce Mr. Bill Blaylock to all of you. So let me just share my screen to show a summary of Mr. Blaylock's impressive achievements. Mr. Blaylock uh, is serving as currently as the chairman of the Museum of the American Railroad at Frisco in Texas. To this position, he brings a strong educational background as an attorney as well as a working experience. Prior to the current role as the chairman of the Museum of the American Railroad, Bill was a vice president at Texas Instruments. He has served in various roles, especially as chairman amongst various nonprofits. Due to his impressive work with various nonprofits, he received the TI Founders Community Impact Award. He has also served as a chairman of various business, industry, and professional associations and groups and committees. He also conducts continuing professional education programs for CPAs, attorneys, and IRS agents. Adding to his list of impressive achievements, he has served as a chairman of the Texas Taxpayer and Research Association and as a member of the Tax Reform Committee under Governor Perry. Amongst various things that he is most passionate about, it is teaching STEM courses to kids belonging to the K till the 9th grade at the museum in Frisco. Today's program covers America's first transcontinental railroad and its effects. The presentation will cover the invention of the steam locomotive and early railroads, the influence of Abraham Lincoln in establishing a transcontinental railroad to California, and he will also dwell on the contest between two competing railroad companies building towards each other and government incentives to finance the railroads. The presentation will end with a massive financial scandal and the economic, social, and other consequences of the development of the railroad in the early 19th century United States. So over to you, Bill. The floor is all yours. And let me share your PPT. Over to you, Bill. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Manny, for that introduction. When I first started visiting with Manny, as I indicated in my resume, I was at Texas Instruments. I was the chief tax officer along with other roles. And as a consequence of that, I told Manny I spent millions and millions of dollars with his current employer. And so I like to think that we got very good value for the work that his firm did for us. When I speak of this presentation, we are being joined by our president or our CEO, Bob Laprelle, and our chief operating officer, Kelly Murphy. They're also on the line. I told them if I need help, I will call out to them. Okay, next. Our museum has several aspects, but primarily we have an outdoor collection. We've got some examples here of some of our locomotives, and we have a lot of passenger cars also. That locomotive at the top is the largest steam engine ever built. It was owned and operated, there were 24 of them, by the Union Pacific Railroad. And the wheel configuration, you can see there, it has well, the configuration is 4-8-8-4. It has two sets of driving wheels and two sets of pistons. Additionally, we have an indoor collection, and it's a very substantial layout. It involves about 2,500 square feet of layout and track and a replica of downtown Dallas in the period of about 1960. This is in G scale, which here in the US is the largest scale of the model railroads or railroad equipment. And it's designed for outdoor use in addition to indoor use. Next. Okay, these are our educational programs or examples of our educational programs. We have presented information on the history of railroads, their social impact, their economic impact on the country, and how they operate logistically, the science behind railroads. We've done this for about 30,000 students from the grade schools, third grade and seventh graders. Also, you can see me putting on an example of the operation of a small steam engine when we teach science to these students. And then there is a representative example of the audiences that we get. This particular example is there were 11 Texas state government agencies that came and listened to our program on the Pullman Porters in Austin, Texas. Next. Okay, we have several programs, and this will be the Transcontinental Railroad, and you can see the track configuration of the two railroads that came and met in more or less in the middle of the Western U.S. And then once they were unified, then you can see a poster that is representative of some of the advertising the railroad company started putting out to the public. You could now go in about 4 days from Omaha, Nebraska to San Francisco. That was a remarkable change in transportation. Okay, next. One of our other programs is we do a program on the Pullman Porters, who were African-American employees of the Pullman Car Company. The Pullman Company manufactured and operated very luxurious passenger cars, and additionally dining cars and parlor cars and sleeping cars that were in the part of the rail development from right after the Civil War up until right before World War II. The Pullman Porters were African Americans who served the customers on the railroad, and the railroad offered them a path to the Black middle class, which was kind of unique because these guys operated in right after the Civil War up until the 1950s. And they operated in an environment that was very racially segregated in the U.S. And they have a story, and we like to tell that story because many of these guys had, as I said, a path to the middle class in their lives, and they were able to educate their children. They were able to buy homes. They had good jobs for the times. One of the descendants of the Pullman porters, there are many notable African Americans today who are descendants, but one of them is Michelle Obama, the President Obama's wife. Her grandfather was a Pullman porter, and so there's some good stories there. But again, in the middle of a bad environment. Next. And we also do STEAM as a source of energy. This is one of my favorite instructional programs. It is for students up to about the age of 12 or so. And we run a steam engine, a model steam engine that was in that photograph. And then we talk about the principles of a heat engine. And we also talk about other forms of steam. For example, people do not think about it, but the steam engine generates about 80% of the world's electricity today. It is a steam turbine engine, and it's a closed system, and often it's a nuclear fueled system. And then we also have a program that includes the internal combustion engine. The steam engine is an external combustion engine, and we talk about the differences. Okay, next. Okay, looking at the history of railroads in the U.S., the technology came from England. Much of the early equipment came from England. And the early railroads and the first chartered railroad for passenger service was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, chartered in 1828. And we also like to comment that the early railroads competed with canals. The canal network in the U.S. and primarily in the northeastern U.S. Was the only means of mass transportation that existed until the railroads came along. They were slow moving. They had barges that were pulled by horses along narrow canals. The advantage of a canal, however, was that a horse pulling a barge could pull 60,000 pounds of product. These were almost always agricultural products. And it was slow, but it was fairly efficient from a cost standpoint. It was very inefficient to build the canals, however, and often there was a requirement for governments to get involved and help finance the canals. And the most popular canal is probably the Erie Canal, which operated in New York, but there were many other canals, some privately built, some publicly built. And the early railroads had to compete with the canals for freight traffic. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as I mentioned, was chartered in 1828. As a former tax attorney, I have to mention this, and that is that the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad obtained a tax incentive. It obtained a tax abatement to help construct its rail lines. And that goes back to 1829, and it was granted by the legislature in Maryland. The early railroads were not connected. They were chartered by the state. They could not operate outside of their state, whether it's New York or Pennsylvania or Maryland or Virginia. And there was no standard gauge of track between the different railroads that operated within the states. And so they were really not very efficient in terms of being connected. And it was only later that they provided through rail service and interstate service, which made them much, much more efficient. Okay. And yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said next. Pardon me. I would add that it was only not until 1886 that we had a standard gauge with most of our railroads here in the U.S. And that gauge is 3 feet, 8.5 inches. In the South, it was very common for there to be a 5-foot gauge. And then in the the mountainous areas of the West, there was and still today is narrow gauge, which is 3 feet. And there's also a narrow gauge railroad up in Alaska. What if we fast forward to the 1850s, we will see California became a very powerful economic phenomena. And that resulted from the gold rush that occurred. But additionally, there was a development separately from the East Coast economically in San Francisco and the farming communities in San Francisco or in California. Now, the U.S. was really divided. California was very isolated. Travel to San Francisco from the rest of the eastern part of the U.S. really occurred in 3 different options. One could go on a wagon train, and that would typically take 3 months to go from St. Louis, typically, out to the West Coast. It may be Oregon, it may be San Francisco, Northern California. It was dangerous. It was probably the most dangerous of the 3 options. And that is not because of the native tribes that the U.S. had, the indigenous tribes that were all over the West and portrayed in cowboy movies. Really, they did not provide much of a danger. They more or less allowed the wagon trains to pass through their territories early on. What was dangerous was cholera, was disease, and it was from bad drinking water that the people on the wagon trains had to endure. And even to a lesser extent, it was just dangerous crossing rivers. Some of the trails were dangerous. And one author has commented there were probably more people who were killed by accidents with guns than there were people who were killed by the native tribes in some attack on the wagon train. But of the 3 options, that was probably the most dangerous. Another option was to sail from the East Coast all the way around the Strait of Magellan, around Cape Horn, and up the west coast of South America and up into the San Francisco area. That was an 18,000-mile journey. It might take 6 months to do that by sailing ship. A third chance or opportunity would be to sail from the East Coast to Panama, cross the jungle, and then connect to a boat on the western side and sail up to the Pacific coast. That was also dangerous, however, because crossing through the jungle, there were lots of diseases that one could catch, and malaria was one of the common diseases, and it often was a fatal disease. So that was not, I would say that was probably ranked as the second most dangerous form of transportation. Now we get forward to Abraham Lincoln. Before he became president, he was a railroad attorney. And because of that background, he and others saw the need for a transcontinental railroad to connect the U.S. out to San Francisco. Lincoln was a railroad attorney, as I indicated, and he knew intimately the economics of railroads. And he acquired that background representing railroad companies. His 2 famous cases were, first, the most prominent is that the Illinois Central tax abatement case. I mentioned the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had a tax abatement given by the government to encourage investment. And actually, almost all of the railroads up through the 1860s had tax abatements offered by state governments. The case of the Illinois Central Railroad was one where the legislature in Illinois granted a tax abatement to the Illinois Central Railroad to lay track right down the middle of Illinois, north to south, down into Missouri and all the way down to New Orleans, actually. And as I mentioned, the state awarded the tax abatement. However, McLean County, Illinois, created a problem. They said, guys, you, the legislature, do not have the authority or the right to take away my tax base here in McLean County, Illinois. And it started to tax the Illinois Central Railroad with property tax. And the railroad retained Abraham Lincoln, and in one of his very notable cases, he took it to the Illinois Supreme Court and got a ruling that the right of the McLean County to tax the railroad was really subjugated to the authority of the legislature to issue a tax abatement. And that pretty much prevailed as a principle of law in other courts around the country as tax abatements started becoming controversial. Okay, the other thing is Abraham and Lincoln and others realized, especially when he was president, that there were very important economic, social, and importantly, military benefits for a national network of railroads. And the Civil War illustrated that very, very dramatically, such that European nations, their military leaders, started observing the operation of railroads and the influence they had in the Civil War here in the U.S. They realized how important railroads could be in delivering munitions, delivering troops, removing the military personnel, removing wounded people, and all of the supplies and the logistics of supplying a military operation. And the other thing I would note is that early on, there were several railroad routes that were proposed by civil engineers who went out and mapped several possible routes for a transcontinental railroad. The most obvious that was easy to implement from an engineering standpoint was a southern route that would go from Omaha, Nebraska, and that's pretty much the starting point for all of the proposed railroad routes. Omaha, Nebraska, down to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then across the southern U.S. to the California coast. However, there was a North versus South rivalry at the time, and the Northern legislators blocked any route to the South because they did not want the economic benefit to go to the South over a transcontinental route. So as a result, the route that was finally awarded was the route that we see going from Omaha, Nebraska, north of Denver, headed west, meeting in Utah, and then going from, the two railroads met in Utah, going from Utah across the Nevada desert into Sacramento. And then technically, we talk about a transcontinental railroad going from Omaha, Nebraska to San Francisco, but that really is not what happened. The railroad route stopped at Sacramento, the capital of California, and there was a pre-existing railroad because there were a few railroads in California that were strictly local and strictly short lines. However, they did exist, and there was a connection from Sacramento to Los Angeles. Next. Okay, now, obviously, a transcontinental railroad was not a commercially viable operation without government help. The cost of building the railroad, all of the materials, the labor for putting down the track, building bridges and trestles and water towers and everything, all of that infrastructure, simply there were no capital markets that could possibly provide financing for something like this. The financing had to come from the government in one form or another. Lincoln saw, as I indicated, the big economic benefits or the spillover benefits from a transcontinental railroad. Today, an economist would call these positive externalities. An economist would tell you, somebody comes along, he may say big investment. It could be in a capital project for a factory or a railroad. It could be an R&D facility, whatever it is, that person bears all of the cost of that investment or that activity, but does not get all the benefit. And that's because there are spillover benefits. If I build a massive R&D facility somewhere in Texas, for example, I am not going to get all of the benefit from that. The neighboring community is going to get some of the benefit, and that's going to appear in the form of businesses that support my activity. That leads to employment, that leads to more cars, automobiles sold by car dealers. It will spill over into schools and restaurants and economic activity for the communities. That was well known to Lincoln and his followers back in the 1860s. Eventually, there was federal legislation in 1862 and later in 1864, and it authorized a massive incentive package to the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad. They would build toward each other in a contest. The Union Pacific coming from Omaha, Nebraska, building to the west, the Central Pacific coming from the San Francisco area and building to the east. The government provided loans to these railroads, and you can see the loans at $16,000 per track mile was the basic package of loans, but it went to $32,000 for difficult terrain and $48,000 for per mile for mountainous terrain. There were land grants, and these were the really massive millions and millions of acres were given to the railroads. And it was in the form of, for each mile of track that you lay as a railroad company, you will receive 10 square miles of land adjoining the railroad track. And that was alternating. There would be 10 miles on the northern side of a 1 mile stretch of track. The next 1 mile of track, there would be 10 miles on the southern side. Then there were alternating parcels of track. Next. Okay, the construction took place from the years 1863 to 1869, and it can, as you can imagine, was a monumental feat. Each railroad had up to 10,000 workers that were on each end of the operation. These consisted of surveyors. They were the first people into an area. They would map out the route of the railroad. They had to take into account the grades that the locomotives could pull. They had to take into account where there were crossings over rivers or areas that required landfill. Where do we have the railroad go left and right as it starts to go up a grade, as opposed to directly trying to ascend a grade that was beyond the capability of the locomotives of the time. They also built telegraph lines, and I'm not going to talk very much about telegraph lines, but that's a very important part of the railroad history. The telegraph lines were built right next to the track, and they are part of the connectivity story behind the Transcontinental Railroad. The first telegraph line that was transcontinental actually was built around 1861. And it followed the Oregon Trail, more or less, that the settlers traveled. And not completely, but more or less followed that route. It had a single channel. When we get to 1863 to 1869, the railroads were putting in telegraph lines next to the track, and it was a 5-channel telegraph line. And so there could be as many as 5 messages being transmitted all at once. Supply trains followed with a rail, 400 rails per mile. wooden ties, 2,500 ties per mile, and then other supplies. Professional hunters had to supply buffalo meat and other forms of game because really there weren't any cattle available to raise out in the desert areas and the mountainous areas. The railroads had to obtain food from professional hunters, and then some food products were brought in on the trains. And additionally, water had to be brought in for the employees, and then water, of course, for locomotives, because in many instances, the locomotives were traversing a desert, and the water was very difficult to find, and there were great distances between the sources of water. These crews were strung out for up to 200 miles, starting with the surveyors, and then the dynamiters and the graders and the bridge and the trestle builders, and then the track layers. Following the railroads, predictably, were temporary camps, and they were called Hell on Wheels. These had nothing to do with the official operation of the railroads. These were groups that just followed the track layers, and they put up temporary saloons and places for gambling, places for other sources of entertainment, I'm sure, but that's all another story. But these camps were called Hell on Wheels. They were very often violent. The track workers would come in from their day and get paid, and they would go straight to the saloons and gambling and things that occurred because of the tough life that these guys led, and having access to today's wages and access to whiskey and gambling. You can just imagine what these Hell on Wheels were like. Okay, next. Now, these are some photographs from the Pacific side with the Central Pacific heading east. There were many Chinese laborers that were imported by agents who were in the Canton province of China, and recruited laborers who came and formed much, not all, but much of the labor force that pushed to the east. On the eastern side, pushing to the west, you had many people who were, these were guys who were veterans of the Civil War. Many of them by background were Irish, German, British, Scottish, Norwegian, Italian. There were different ethnic groups that were behind the labor that were pushing to the west. And these are some examples of some of the track laying that took place. You can see that trestle there. It's just by itself is a monumental feat. And wooden trestles were built because they had to cross over very large open gullies or rivers to accommodate the locomotives. Next. Okay, these are some of the leaders, and they were controversial on both sides of this, endeavor. On the Union Pacific side, heading, west from Omaha, Nebraska, you had some characters. One was Thomas Durant. He was the finance person who conceived finance, and he was a physician by background, by education. But he did not practice medicine for very long and got involved in finance. And he was the individual who structured a financial arrangement we'll talk about in a minute. Another was Grenville Dodge. He was an officer in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was the chief engineer. He was responsible for making it happen. Then you had some owners, Oakes Ames and Oliver Ames. These two brothers had become wealthy by manufacturing and distributing shovels, of all things, and they had a very notable brand of shovel, and those brands are still sold today in hardware stores here in the U.S. But they were quite wealthy, and they were part of the early management of the Union Pacific Railroad. On the western side, the Central Pacific, you had four characters. Leland Stanford, and he later became the founder of Stanford University in Northern California. Collis Huntington, Huntington Beach, California, was named after Collis Huntington. Charles Crocker. Crocker later, he was a railroad builder, and he later built the Southern Pacific Railroad, which we'll talk about briefly. And then Mark Hopkins. Mark Hopkins was today, in fact, in San Francisco, there's still the Mark Hopkins Hotel. All of these individuals became quite wealthy. And they were known as the robber barons on the Central Pacific side. That was the portrayal of them in all of their economic shenanigans that took place. All of these individuals made a lot of money, but they did not make their wealth by operating a railroad. They became wealthy by building the railroad and engaging in some financial engineering that basically profited them. Okay, next. Jumping ahead to the ceremony, and we will get back to the financial stuff that these guys did. But the ceremony of the Transcontinental Railroad, the union that took place in Utah, in Promontory Point in northern Utah, near Ogden, Utah, and north of Salt Lake City, Utah. This took place on May 10, 1869. The 881 miles of track from the west joined the 1,032 miles of track from the east. It was a grand celebration. However, it was delayed by several days. Thomas Durant, in a private car, was to appear several days before May 10th. And he was delayed because there were some, I just got a note. I may have changed to another language. I hope I can be heard correctly here.
You're fine, Bill.
Okay, yeah, I just got this note that I may have changed languages. Okay, I'm sorry. Continuing, there was a worker strike because the workers had not been paid by the Union Pacific. And the strike occurred in Wyoming, and the workers attacked Thomas Durant's car, and they prevented it from continuing to the celebration until they were finally paid. Okay, there was a lot of confusion and lack of crowd control at the ceremony. Here, and then when it was done, there was a message that was sent out. And then there were celebrations all over America. In Chicago, there was a 7-mile parade celebrating the Transcontinental Railroad. New York City had a 100 cannon salute downtown. And then in Sacramento, California, 30 locomotives were lined up next to each other and blew a chorus of whistles with their steam whistles. It was a very, very substantial ceremony. Okay, next. Here is the classic photograph that, let me get rid, okay, here is the classic photograph that is in all of the books about railroad history in the US. On the right is the Union Pacific joining with, on the left, the Central Pacific. The employees are all facing each other. Some of the dignitaries are passing a bottle of champagne between the two of them. And then there was the famous golden spike ceremony where a spike made of gold was hammered into the last tie connecting the railroads. I might add that later on that spike was removed, and today it appears at a museum in Sacramento, California. And then you can see I've pulled one of the many, many headlines from newspapers back in the day celebrating the event. Next. Okay, shenanigans, economic things that took place. And this actually, we will talk a little bit about the effects of the railroads and the railroad network in the 19th century. And one of the effects is the huge influence it had on law, all aspects of law. And we're going to go through an example here that was a very early, clever, and unethical and illegal use of a special purpose corporation. Okay, and so what we have here is the controlling shareholders of the Union Pacific. And now the same thing occurred with the Central Pacific, exactly the same series of transactions. But here's the Union Pacific as an example. The shareholders created Credit Mobile, and that was a new subsidiary of the shareholders. Well, and the shareholders, I should say, are individuals, not corporations. So these were individuals. They owned a controlling interest in the Union Pacific. There were a lot of minority shareholders, many of them in Europe, many of them, from New York, the Wall Street area. But these guys formed Credit Mobile, a new company. Next, that was step one. Step number two, they entered into contracts for the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad. Construction contractors, they let contracts for labor contractors, and then all the construction materials they purchased. That was roughly, it's estimated, not precisely known, but it's estimated that those costs totaled $51 million. And Credit Mobile engaged those subcontractors and paid them $51 million, turned right around and billed an estimated $95 million to the Union Pacific Railroad. And so it served as an intermediary. When you ask, well, what was the economic value added by Credit Mobile? Not really very much. They paid invoices and they billed invoices, and that was it. They had no substantive number of employees or any operations outside of simply being a clearinghouse between cost and revenues. And step three, next. Okay, the controlling shareholders sold stock in Credit Mobile to elected officials in Congress. These were U.S. senators and U.S. representatives in Congress, and they sold the stock at substantially below the market value of Credit Mobile. Now, Credit Mobile was not a publicly listed company. However, it was easy to figure out what the company was worth. Okay, step number four, next. The next step was Credit Mobile paid massive dividends, mostly, of course, to the controlling shareholders, but to minority shareholders, including elected officials. And this scheme became known by a reporter at the New York Times, and he published a big article of, revelation of this transaction in 1873, and it involved congressional hearings. There were some indictments. Some of the people were prosecuted, but at the end of the day, not really very much happened of consequence to any of the people that were involved. We had high-level officials who were essentially bribed, and they gave favors to the Union Pacific Railroad in the form of giving extensions on repayment of loans, creating new rounds of loans for the construction of the railroad. And I would add again, the same thing was going on with the Central Pacific. They had a financing company, and they had the same kinds of self-dealing and same kinds of transactions. And this gets to my point that these people that owned the railroad, minority or majority interests, they did not acquire their wealth by operating the railroad. In fact, the Union Pacific Railroad struggled constantly with cash flow and cash needs, and eventually went bankrupt after this, a decade or so after all of this occurred. But they made money by building the railroad and engaging in financing transactions. Okay, next. All right, scandals and abuse. There were other things that went on, a lot of insider trading, bond manipulation. The railroads engaged in economic leverage. You can't really blame them for doing this, but people today would say it's clearly unethical. But they had the ability to pick winners and losers. When a railroad came to town, that town was a winner. When the railroad bypassed a town, that town was a loser. And we have examples of their behaviors. In Colorado, there was a town, Animas City. It was near a major military reservation in the 1880s. And the Rio Grande Western Railroad, narrow gauge railroad, when it was going into southern Colorado to access the silver mines up in Silverton, Colorado. It went through southern Colorado. It needed a place to stage water resources and repair shops and all of the things that a railroad would need to address a route farther to the north up into the mines. Animas City was the logical choice. It was established, it had businesses, it had schools, it had farming and ranching around it. But the Denver Rio Grande Railroad actually established the town. That town today is Durango, Colorado, and it established it about 3 or 4 miles away from Animas City. Animas City no longer exists. As soon as the railroad established Durango, all of the people in Animas City had to move to Durango. And of course, the railroad owned all of the real estate in Durango and sold lots to the hotels and the restaurants and the businesses that relocated from Animas City to Durango. And Animas City is non-existent today. Same thing happened in North Texas. And there was a town, Lebanon, Texas. The railroad bypassed Lebanon, Texas, and established Frisco, Texas. With the town at the time, it was called Emerson, Texas. Later on, it changed its name, and that's where our railroad museum today is headquartered. There was no legislation or regulation whatsoever on the charges for freight or for passenger traffic. It was all that the market will bear. There was no regulation at all in the early years after the railroad, after the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, what happened? The states started regulating railroads, and then eventually the federal government came in and preempted the states and established the Interstate Commerce Commission. At that point, everything the railroads did was regulated. If you wanted to establish a new route, you had to appear before the Interstate Commerce Commission and explain why it's good for all of the parties concerned. If you wanted to withdraw that route, you had to go get permission. If you wanted to change your pricing, you had to get permission. The pricing was established by the Interstate Commerce Commission. So the railroads evolved from being totally unregulated to being the most regulated industry in the country. Next. Okay, passenger traffic, 1869 to 1900, looking at the railroads. It started actually kind of slowly, but it grew. And then by 1885, there were 4 more transcontinental railroads, and then hundreds of small feeder railroads throughout the country, but in particular in the West. The railroads took the land from their grants and they sold them to farmers. The railroads had agents in Europe who would go around and market their farm property was available for sale near the railroads, and they would sell to immigrant farmers coming in from Europe. And of course, many people also immigrating simply from the eastern US. The land was not always very good land for farming purposes. There were some misrepresentations there, but the land did become valuable in its own right because it was right next to the railroad. Now, the Western railroads, they did struggle with overcapacity. There were 5 transcontinental railroads, and that led to some mergers and some bankruptcies. Next, we get into the 1890s, and the love affair with railroads was pretty much over. In the 1800s up to the point of the Transcontinental Railroad, and for several years thereafter, the railroads were absolute heroes as part of the U.S. Economic environment, the social, the connectivity. But the public sentiment soon turned against them because of their monopolistic behavior. There was a Granger movement, which was a union of farmers and agricultural people who formed up political alliances, and such that the railroads lost their political influence. And then you had some legislation. You had major You had some major economic disruptions in 1893. And at that point, the railroads really struggled because there were over 150 of them that went bankrupt. Yes, next. Okay, here's
I'll
a
just
map.
take a short time check here. Bill, we have
Oh
10
yes.
more minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Manny. Here's a map. It shows the railroad network in 1870, and then the lower one shows the railroad network in 1890. And and the message here is connectivity. The railroad networks greatly connected the U.S. And I would also add, when we talk about one of the economic effects of railroads, usually when we do this, it is, of course, to a Texas audience. You look at the railroad network in the U.S. In Texas in 1870 and look at it in 1890. One of the effects of that railroad network in Texas was the end of the great romantic cattle drives that the cowboys were involved in, that have been portrayed in so many movies and Western novels. And that is simply, it was no longer economically viable to take a big herd of cattle and maybe 30 or 40 cowboys and move the cattle overland up into Kansas where the railroad was established. And those railroad towns that received the cattle drives were Abilene and Dodge. They were very notorious towns. They were violent towns. There's a lot of stories about them. All of that disappeared when the railroad network reached down into Texas. Next. Okay, the effects, connectivity, very quickly here. The country was completely, I should say, the change that occurred was how people were influenced by time and distance. It was all the difference in the world to travel in the 1890s than it was in the 1840s. And we talked about how people moved across the Western U.S. to California. The West was facilitated in terms of settlement. All of the land became available for sale by the railroads. Leisure, baseball teams could travel. Baseball was a viable professional sport in the 1870s. The circus could come to town. Families could vacation and visit relatives. As I mentioned, the effects include law, in particular, mergers and acquisition, securities law, bankruptcy, lobbying, tax law, labor law. They were all developed by the railroads or enhanced by the railroads. Productivity gains. Producers everywhere now had access to markets. Consumers had more choices. The Industrial Revolution was deployed, of course. And then, importantly, the railroads became the largest corporations and employers in the world at that time. They established management functions that were new to business. And I would add, in 1885, the Pennsylvania Railroad had 50,000 employees. Can you imagine how difficult it was to manage that railroad when you had the tools available that were communication tools and computational tools in the 1800s? How do you keep up with all of the agents that were handling cash, across your railroad network, all of the assets that you have, the cars, the locomotives, all of the ticketing, problems that you had? It was a very, very large undertaking by large corporations. Next. I love to show this. One of the effects of railroads is a house could be ordered through the mail. And this was, it still is, a house built in 1905. A good friend of mine's mother lived in that house growing up. Her family built the house in 1905. The entire home showed up in 2 railroad cars in the form of a kit with instructions, with nails, with glass, everything you needed to build that house. And when he and I were talking about this one day, across the table from us, there were some guys from Chicago, and they said, well, there were whole towns south of Chicago that were homes built from kits that were supplied by railroads. That is just an example of the connectivity. Okay, next. Parting thought from Stephen Ambrose. This is worth reading if you have not read it and you want to study America's Transcontinental Railroad. A man whose birthday was in 1829 or earlier had been born into a world in which President Andrew Jackson traveled no faster than Julius Caesar, a world in which no thought or information could be transmitted any faster than in the days of Alexander the Great. By 1869, America was connected. Next. Thank you, guys.
All right, Bill. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I think it provided a very comprehensive overview of the development of railroad in the United States and how it impacted every aspect of the American life. So, and we also got to know little note snippets as to how Abraham Lincoln was not only a unifier of the country during the Civil War, but he was also a unifier across many other aspects as well, with respect to transportation, with respect to tax law, so on and so forth. And your presentation covered the economic aspects, the financial scandals, and everything else. I think it was a very comprehensive overview. Thank you very much. And we do have some questions. I just wanted to check with the organizers. Can we go a couple of minutes over the time, sir, to cover those questions, or how do you
A
want
few
to go
minutes will do, but don't take more than a few minutes.
Sure, sir. So the first question we have is from Sujail Singh himself. So he was asking, was there a transcontinental highway that was built? When was a transcontinental highway that was built? And not the railroad, the highway.
The first paved highway, there was just a network of dirt roads, really. But the first paved highway goes from Chicago to the Santa Monica Pier, just outside of Los Angeles. And it was called the Mother Road. And it was completed, I believe, it started in the 1920s, and it was completed, I believe, in the early 1930s. I'm not 100% certain of that. That is Route 66. That was the designation for that highway. And Route 66, in and of its own, was sort of a romantic highway. There had been songs about Route 66. There was even a TV program back in the 1960s about two guys who traveled Route 66, different jobs, and just a TV series. They had different jobs, they had different encounters, different dramas, and it was all about two individuals who traveled up and down Route 66 as young men, just looking for adventure. And it was called the Mother Road. And it has been portrayed in movies, and in fact, today, this morning, we were coming on the old Route 66. Now it's a more interstate highway, more modern interstate highway. But we were coming through New Mexico, back from Colorado, and we were on the old Route 66. But it was called the Mother Road. And now later on, today's really good network of transcontinental roads, the interstate railroad, the interstate highway system, was established by President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And basically, there was a movement that it is needed for purposes of military defense. We need a comprehensive highway network so that we can respond rapidly to any event that might arise where we have to deploy military resources. So our highway system today, when you travel it's really started with President Eisenhower.
Okay. We just have one more minute. We do have some questions, but what I'm thinking, sir, we will definitely connect with you offline for the other questions. And as you had mentioned earlier, if you can share the links to the books and materials that you had used so that people can refer more
Yes.
about the development of the railroading in the United States, I think that would really be great. So that's all I had. And over to you, Mr. Pandey, for the subsequent sessions.